Even before World War II, there were signs of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. When the fighting was finally over, those tensions grew to create what became known as a Cold War, a long and dangerous rivalry between two former allies that cast a shadow over international affairs and American domestic life for more than 4 decades. At the heart of the rivalry between the two countries was a fundamental difference in the ways the great powers envisioned the post-war world. The vision laid out by the Atlantic Charter, in which nations abandoned their old military alliances and governed their relations with one another through democratic processes, appealed to the Americans. The other vision, supported by the Soviet Union and many leaders in Britain, resembled the older European balance of power. The differences between these two positions turned the peacemaking process into a form of warfare. The relationship between American and Soviet officials was strained even during the war, when Roosevelt and Churchill delayed opening the war on the Western Front in favor of the North African and Italian campaigns. At a 1943 meeting between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, the Soviet leader found himself in the minority opinion regarding the fate of nations like Poland. Where Roosevelt and Churchill preferred smaller European nations choose their own fate after the war, Stalin favored installing a communist government in nations like Poland to act as a buffer against further aggressions onto Soviet territory. Stalin later promised free and unfettered elections in Poland, but they didn't happen until 1989. At a conference in Yalta toward the end of the war, debates over the fate of Germany too were conflicted. Stalin wanted to impose heavy reparations or fines on Germany, and then carve up the country to prevent future acts of aggression. What the three powers agreed to, though, was to separate the country into zones of occupation, controlled in pieces by the Allies, including France. The city of Berlin, so symbolically important, was itself divided into 4 occupied sectors. The Allies agreed to reunite Germany at a later, indeterminate date, and how they decided how to carve up Germany was just based on where the troops were at the end of the war. That's how the East Germany becomes Soviet Germany. In the most important decision to come out of those Yalta Accords, the 3 Allied powers agreed to a plan for a new international organization, the United Nations. It was to contain a General Assembly in which each member would be represented, and a Security Council with permanent representatives of the 5 major world powers: the United States, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. It's kind of like the House and the Senate. In sharp contrast to the American rejection of the League of Nations a generation before, the U.S. Senate ratified the UN Charter in July of 1945 by an 80-2 vote. It was, many internationalists believed, a second chance to create a stable world order. After the conference at Yalta, the interpretation of those accords that they struck differed sharply between leaders. In the weeks following the conference, Roosevelt watched with growing alarm as the Soviet Union moved to establish pro-communist governments in Central and Eastern European nations. Still believing their differences could be settled, Roosevelt left Washington for a vacation in Warm Springs, Georgia, and suffered a stroke that killed him. Rather than settle post-war issues, the Allies sidestepped the most difficult questions put before them at the Yalta Conference. And now Roosevelt, the man who had shepherded the American people from the beginning of the Great Depression through the end of the Second World War, was dead. The man who assumed the presidency, Harry S. Truman, had no international experience, and he did not trust Stalin the way Roosevelt had. At Potsdam in Russian-occupied Germany, Churchill, Stalin, and now Truman met to wrap up European negotiations. Truman recognized the Soviet-backed government of Poland, hoping that non-communist forces would soon win out in Poland, but they did not. Truman, though, refused to permit the Russians to claim any reparations from the American, French, and British zones of Germany. This stance confirmed that Germany would remain divided, the Western zones ultimately unified into one nation friendly to the United States, and the other zone survived as another pro-Soviet communist nation. Halfway around the world, America pinned its hopes for peace in Asia to a strong, independent China. The Chinese government was corrupt, incompetent, and unpopular, though, and Mao Zedong's communist armies controlled 1/4 of the country by 1945. Torn between his 2 options, Truman reluctantly pumped money and weapons to the current elected government, even as communists overwhelmed Chinese politics. Even as China fell to communist forces, American officials recognized the power of a new pro-Western Japan. Abandoning the strict occupation policies of the early post-war years, when General MacArthur governed the nation of Japan, The United States soon lifted restrictions on industry and encouraged economic growth, and the vision of an open, united world was giving way in Asia, as it was in Europe, to an acceptance of a divided world with a strong pro-American sphere of influence. It's very interesting. So we carve up Germany after the war. Japan, we put General MacArthur in charge. It's not very long after the war that we realized that we need a pro-Western power in Asia, and so very quickly we let Japan get back to business as it was before the war. They become an ally, though, very quickly after the war. With Germany, it takes longer to make that happen. By 1945, a new American foreign policy called Containment was emerging. Rather than attempting to create a unified, open world, the United States and its allies would work to constrain the threat of further Soviet expansion. Behind the theories of U.S. diplomat George Kennan, President Truman created his Truman Doctrine, an American policy to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. End quote. He asked Congress for money to support democratic forces in Turkey and Greece, and with their support, communist insurgents were defeated, and the basis for American policy toward the Soviet Union was formalized. While Truman's containment attracted broad support for dealing with the new Cold War, not everyone supported it. American liberals believed that the policies of containment were unnecessarily belligerent to our former Soviet allies, while American conservatives feared containment was too weak a response to communism, that indeed it was a kind of appeasement, in the same way that we'd appeased Hitler. Some conservatives were so fearful of communism that they believed it was treasonous to simply contain or try to contain Soviet influence, and they pointed to the creation of the United Nations as evidence that world leaders secretly planned to create a one-world socialist government. Opposition to containment reached some of the highest levels of the federal government, where in smoky, dark rooms, conservative politicians and officials advocated for years that rather than contain it, the United States should roll back communism where it encroached, even if it meant starting World War III. An integral part of containment policy were proposals to aid in the reconstruction of Western Europe devastated by the war. American motives certainly included humanitarian concerns for the European people and a fear that Europe would remain an economic drain if the U.S. did not rebuild it. But above all else, American policymakers believed that unless something could be done to strengthen Western European governments, the people of Western Europe might too fall under control of communist forces. Secretary of State George C. Marshall announced a plan in 1947 to provide economic assistance to all European nations, including the Soviet Union, who would join into a shared recovery program. Remember, 50 million people 50 million civilians die in the war, so Western Europe is devastated from everywhere from France to Britain to Germany to Italy to Russia and everywhere in between. They're really cleaning up a mess. Although Russia and its eastern satellites rejected the plan, 16 Western European nations eagerly participated. The Marshall Plan, as it came to be called, channeled $13 billion of American aid into Europe over the next 3 years, sparking an economic recovery and strengthening opportunities for American trade and continued friendship. I've seen pictures of kids getting shoes, American shoes. It was certainly a goodwill plan, and it was certainly a humanitarian crisis that we helped out with in Western Europe. But we did it partly because we knew it was in our best interest too. In 1948, with the threat of communism ever present, Congress approved a new military draft, revived the selective service system, and redoubled its efforts to elevate nuclear and hydrogen weaponry to a central place in its military arsenal. At the same time, the National Security Act of 1947 reshaped the nation's military and diplomatic institutions, creating the Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, and the National Security Council, which operated out of the White House. The United States moved to strengthen the military capabilities. The United States also moved to strengthen the military capabilities of Western Europe. England and France agreed to merge their western zones of German occupation with America's zone. Stalin responded by placing a blockade around the western portion of Berlin, and Truman had supplies airlifted in over the blockade for 10 months, keeping nearly 2 million people alive in Berlin until Stalin lifted the order. In this way, the division of Germany into two nations, a US-backed federal republic in the west and the Soviet-backed democratic republic in the east, became official. After the crisis in Berlin, the consolidation of Western nations became official as well. 12 Western nations signed an agreement establishing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, declaring that an armed attack against one member would constitute an attack on the group. The formation of NATO spurred the Soviets to create an alliance of their own communist governments in Eastern Europe, formalized later by the Warsaw Pact. The Soviets detonated their first atomic weapon in late 1949, just weeks before the pro-Western government in China fell apart. Chinese nationalists fled to the island of Taiwan, and the entire Chinese mainland came under control of a communist government not too different from the Soviets. The fall of China to communism was one of the most traumatic events of the Cold War. It accelerated the fears of communism, and it persuaded many Americans that their government, particularly members of the State Department, were responsible for allowing it to happen. Amid this escalating crisis, President Truman called for a thorough review of American foreign policy. The result of that review, the National Security Council report of 1950, outlined a shift in American position on communism. The report, which is formally called NSC 68, or National Security Council 68, argued that the United States could no longer rely on other nations to help it resist communism. The report called for a quadrupling of the annual defense budget and argued that the United States must move, on its own if necessary, to stop communist expansion wherever it occurred, any time it occurred, and any place it occurred. Despite widespread predictions that the end of the war would send America lurching back into an economic depression, the post-war economy just kept booming. Just days after Japan surrendered, Truman submitted to Congress a 21-point economic plan outlining what he later named the Fair Deal. His plan called for an expansion of Social Security and education benefits, the raising of the minimum wage, long-range environmental and public works planning, and government promotion of scientific progress. But the plan fell prey to the same public and congressional conservatism that had crippled the last years of the New Deal. Using the simple but devastating slogan, "Had enough," the Republican Party of 1946 won control of Congress and moved quickly to reduce government spending, to roll back New Deal programs, and to weaken Roosevelt's union-friendly laws and regulations. In the election of 1948, Truman and his advisors still believed that the American public was not ready to abandon the achievements of Roosevelt's New Deal, despite the stinging results of that midterm election. Throughout 1948, which is the presidential election year, Truman proposed one hopeless reform after another, including the first major civil rights bill of the 20th century, hoping to appeal to enduring democratic loyalties. To no one's surprise, Congress ignored or defeated all of those proposals. Even within his own party, Truman struggled to live up to the legacy of his predecessor. At the Democratic National Convention that year, partly as a result of Truman's new civil rights policies and stances, Southern conservatives in the Democratic Party walked out of the convention and immediately formed the States' Rights, or Dixiecrat Party, with Governor Strom Thurmond as its nominee. At the same time, members of the party's left or liberal wing, contemptuous of what they considered Truman's confrontational stance toward the Soviet Union, abandoned the Democrats for the new Progressive Party. Even ordinary Democrats itched to find a replacement for Truman. And remember, Truman didn't get elected. He was a vice president. Roosevelt died. So this is the first time Truman is running for president, really. Some of these Democrats invited Dwight D. Eisenhower, the popular war hero, to contest the nomination, but he politely declined to contest the nomination of a sitting president. That's happened very few times in American history. The Republicans, meanwhile, once again nominated Governor Thomas Dewey of New York, who seemed an unbeatable alternative. Only Truman really seemed to believe he could win. And to the surprise of almost everyone, he did. And it's partly because these different groups are running. There's a lot of confusion with the election. It's very, very close. But Truman pulls it out. So what we're seeing here is the fracturing of the Democratic Party. With under Roosevelt, remember, he had all these different sorts of people voting Democrat. Even these let's see here, rural blacks in the South were voting. Westerners were voting for him. Progressives were voting for him. It was a big Democratic tent back then. And with Truman, what we're seeing is it's kind of breaking. It's breaking in the middle. It's breaking on the edges. But he still wins that 1948 election. So we're still Democratic here. Truman used his new political capital to make some progress. He got the minimum wage raised, expanded Social Security, passed the National Housing Act of 1949, which provided for the construction of nearly 1 million units of low-income housing across the country. But on other issues, including national health insurance and aid to education, Truman made little progress. Nor was he able to persuade Congress to accept the civil rights legislation he had partly campaigned on, legislation that would have made lynching a federal crime, provided federal protection of black voting rights, abolished poll taxes, and curbed discrimination in hiring. Undeterred, Truman ordered an end to discrimination in the hiring of government employees and began to dismantle segregation in the armed forces and pushed the Justice Department to more actively involve itself in court battles against discriminatory statutes. Over this post-war era, of course, hung the image of the terrifying mushroom clouds that had risen over the ruined Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Americans greeted these terrible new instruments of destruction with equal measures of fear and expectation. The fear permeated American pop culture during the film noir era in Hollywood. Although the style of film originated in France, American films like The Third Man and The Big Sleep portrayed the loneliness of individuals in an impersonal world and spoke to the looming possibility of vast destruction. On television, The Twilight Zone featured dramatic portrayals of the aftermath of nuclear war. And at the same time, comic books began to depict powerful superheroes saving the world not from Hitler, but from total nuclear destruction. Such images and ideas resonated with the public because an awareness of nuclear weapons was built into their everyday lives. Schools and office buildings practiced air raid drills to prepare for the possibility of nuclear attack. Radio stations began to test the emergency broadcast system, which stood in readiness for war. Fallout shelters stocked with water and canned goods sprang up in public schools and in private homes. After it dropped the atomic bomb, America grew more anxious. But it also grew more dazzled by its own prosperity and excited by the technological innovations transforming the nation, including nuclear power. When World War II ended, both the United States and the Soviet Union had troops in Korea fighting the Japanese, and after Japan surrendered, neither army was willing to leave. Instead, they divided the nation, supposedly temporarily, along the 38th parallel, with a pro-Western government in the south and a communist government in the north. Toward the end of Truman's time in office, the armies of communist North Korea swept across their southern border and invaded the pro-Western half of the peninsula. Within days, they had occupied Seoul, its capital, with the goal of reuniting the fractured country under communist rule. Almost immediately, the United States committed to the conflict with the support of the still organizing United Nations behind them. Though they hadn't ordered the conflict, the Soviets and the Chinese supported North Korea's campaign once it began. After easily pushing the North Koreans out of South Korea, Truman moved beyond simple containment, ordering General MacArthur to cross the 38th parallel and attack the communists on their own territory. After several weeks of fighting, the North Korean capital of Pyongyang fell, and victory seemed near for MacArthur and Truman. The Chinese government, however, alarmed by the movement of Americans at its border, sent 8 divisions of the Chinese army to intervene on behalf of North Korea. Outnumbered, American forces were forced to retreat, and within weeks, communist forces had retaken Seoul, pushing the American and UN forces even further south than they'd started. By early 1951, though, the UN armies had managed to regain much of the territory they had lost, retaking Seoul and pushing the communists north of the 38th parallel for a second time. With that, the war devolved into a stalemate. From the start, Truman had been determined to avoid a direct conflict with China, which he feared might lead to a new world war. General MacArthur, though, believed the United States should attack China itself, if not with an actual invasion of troops, at least with conventional or even atomic weaponry. Though Truman refused this plan, MacArthur, in response, made his criticism of the president quite public. He wrote a letter that got publicized, and MacArthur was promptly relieved of his command. Something similar happened under Barack Obama. A general in Afghanistan went to Rolling Stone and complained about his policy, Barack Obama's policy, and he was also relieved of his command. Regardless, a Gallup poll showed that 69% of the American people supported MacArthur's plan to attack the Chinese directly. When MacArthur returned to the United States from North Korea, he was greeted with a sort of wild enthusiasm the president had never enjoyed. Stuck in their military stalemate, negotiations between the opposing Korean forces continued on for years. The Korean War came at a time of rising insecurity about America's position in the world. The Korean War produced 140,000 American dead and wounded. After helping to win the greatest war in global history, just a few years later, the United States seemed unable to conclude what many Americans considered a minor border skirmish in a small Asian country. Many began to believe that something must be deeply wrong, not only in Korea, but within the United States itself. Such fears contributed to the second hysterical 20th century campaign against domestic communism. Searching for someone to blame for America's post-war problems, the Republican Party seized on the fear of subversion and refused to let it go. Beginning in 1947, with its House Un-American Activities Committee, Republican leaders sought to investigate claims that, under Democratic rule, the federal government, had tolerated communist subversion within its ranks. They went after Alger Hiss, a former State Department official, and found out that he had ties to the Communist Party. For Richard M. Nixon, nailing Hiss to the wall helped make his political career, but it cast suspicion on a generation of liberal Democrats. The committee turned to the movie industry in America, arguing that communists had infiltrated Hollywood and tainted American films with communist propaganda. Actors and directors were called to testify to their innocence, and while others were barred from employment in the industry, when Hollywood, attempting to protect its public image, adopted an entertainment industry blacklist of those of suspicious loyalty. A lot of writers and directors, even actors, in America were Jewish. They were Jewish immigrants, and a higher percentage of Jews were socialist or communist. And so really, there were quite a few people in Hollywood that had at least connections to people that were communists. And so a lot of people were simply unable to work because Hollywood did not want to get pegged as un-American. Truman, in response to these activities, initiated a widely publicized program to review the loyalty of his federal employees, firing and forcing 2,000 people out of the federal government in a bid to appease Congress and maybe turn down the heat a bit. That federal employee loyalty program helped launch a major assault on subversion throughout the government, and it gave J. Edgar Hoover, the new director of the FBI, enhanced powers to investigate and harass alleged radicals both in and outside the government. In the year 1950, Congress passed a law overriding Truman's veto. It required all American communist organizations to register with the government and publish all their records. Of course, it wasn't technically illegal to be communist in the United States, but it was certainly a black eye. It was something that would give you a lot of notoriety and draw a lot of attention to yourself. And Congress is fearful of communists, that's for sure. That same year, in 1950, Congress uncovered details by way of testimony from a British scientist of a complicated scheme to pass American nuclear know-how on to the Soviets. A machinist on the original Manhattan Project in New Mexico had passed secret information on to his communist sister and her husband in New York, and they had, in turn, passed the information on to the Soviet Union through other agents. After that surprise Soviet detonation of an atomic bomb in 1949, a lot earlier than American officials predicted the Soviets could have a bomb, the Rosenbergs, that husband and wife, were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage. They died in the electric chair just a few years later. All of these realities, the congressional investigations, the Hiss trial, the loyalty investigations within the federal government, and then the Rosenberg case, all of that created a fear of communist subversion that gripped the entire country. State and local governments, universities, corporations, labor unions, all sought to purge themselves of real or imagined subversives and communists. It was in this climate that made possible the rise of an extraordinary public figure. Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, an undistinguished first-term Republican, made a name for himself when he claimed during a speech in West Virginia to hold in his hand a list of 205 known communists working in the American State Department. No person of comparable stature had ever made so bold a claim against the federal government. In the months to come, McCarthy repeated and expanded on his accusations, sometimes on national television, and emerged as the nation's most prominent leader of the crusade against communism at home. With a special Senate subcommittee, he conducted highly publicized investigations of alleged subversion all across the federal government. And we never produced conclusive evidence that any federal employee was actually a communist. Regardless, McCarthy provided Americans in the early 1950s an issue into which they could channel their fear of communism and animosity toward their two-decade affair with liberal democratic governments. We've had pretty liberal policies in America for 20 years, and we're dealing with a Soviet Union that's quite hostile and really poses or could pose a nuclear threat to the United States. So any communist in the United States, while I said earlier it's not illegal to be a communist, the concern is that if you're a communist, you'd sympathize with the Soviets, you might secretly be on the other team, essentially, and you might actually be planning something terrible for the United States. That's where the fear of communism comes from in this era. Public frustration with the Korean War and popular fears about communism in America combined to make 1952 a terrible year for the Democratic Party. Truman withdrew from the presidential contest rather than run for a full second term. In Illinois, Governor Adlai Stevenson, a beloved liberal figure, emerged on top of the Democratic ticket. The Republicans, considering many options, chose General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a military hero, commander of NATO, president of Columbia University, and a man who had no previous identification with the Republican Party. In fact, the Democrats had asked him to run in '48. He chose as his running mate the young California senator who had gained prominence through his crusade against Alger Hiss, Richard Milhous Nixon. Eisenhower attracted support through his statesmanlike pledges to settle the Korean conflict, while his vice presidential candidate Nixon attacked the Democrats for cowardice and appeasement. Together, they took back the presidency in both houses of Congress for the first time. Since the dawn of the Great Depression, the Republicans were in charge. In the harsh climate of the Cold War, neither wealth nor power in post-war America could dispel the anxieties and political differences that still divided the nation.